Here's something strange. If I showed you a roster of the best junior hockey players in Canada, you'd notice something almost immediately. Almost all of them were born in January, February, or March. Not July, not October, not December. It's not a coincidence. It's not superstition. It's not some quirk of Canadian astrology. It's something much darker and much more important, because the same pattern that decides who becomes a professional hockey player also decides who becomes a doctor, a lawyer, a CEO, a billionaire before you ever stepped on the ice, before you ever picked up a book, before you ever tried. A decision had already been made about your life, and you didn't make it. Welcome back. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through every key idea in one of the most important books written about success in the last 20 years, Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers. Let me tell you what this book is actually about. It's not about how to be successful. There are 1,000 books about that, and most of them are wrong in the same way. They all focus on the person, the habits, the mindset, the grit, the hustle. Gladwell looked at that entire genre of thinking and asked one simple question. What if we've been staring at the wrong thing this whole time? What if the secret to understanding why some people rise to the top has almost nothing to do with who they are, and almost everything to do with where they came from, when they were born, and what was happening around them when they were 9 years old? That's the idea that makes this book dangerous, because if Gladwell is right, then every story we tell ourselves about success, every rags to riches biography, every TED Talk about overcoming the odds, is leaving out the most important part. Before we get to Bill Gates, before we get to the Beatles, before we get to the smartest man in America who ended up working on a horse farm, I want to take you to a small town in Pennsylvania, because that's where this book begins. And once you understand what happened in this town, you'll understand everything else. In the late 1950s, a doctor named Stuart Wolf was giving a talk at a medical school in Oklahoma when another doctor walked up to him afterward and said something strange. The doctor was from a town called Roseto in eastern Pennsylvania, a little Italian immigrant community in the Appalachian Hills. And he said, "Stuart, you've been studying heart disease for your whole career. You've been looking for the causes. Come to my town, because in Roseto, almost nobody dies of a heart attack." Wolf was skeptical. This was the 1950s. Heart disease was the #1 killer of American men. It was everywhere. The idea that there was some small town in Pennsylvania where it just didn't happen sounded impossible, so he went. And what he found was more astonishing than he'd imagined. Nobody under the age of 55 in Roseto had died of a heart attack. Nobody. The rate of heart disease for men over 65 was roughly half the national average. The death rate from every cause was 35% lower than it should have been. There was no suicide, no alcoholism, no drug addiction, almost no crime. No one was on welfare. People weren't even getting ulcers. So Wolf spent years, literally years, trying to figure out why. He started with what you'd expect. Diet. Maybe the Rosetans ate something special, some magical Mediterranean ingredient. But no, they cooked with lard, not olive oil. They ate pizza stuffed with sausage and salami. 41% of their calories came from fat. They weren't health nuts. They were Italian grandmothers making Italian grandmother food. Okay, he thought, maybe it's exercise. But it wasn't. Plenty of Rosetans were overweight. Many smoked heavily. Many worked in the slate quarries, breathing in toxic dust all day. Maybe it was genetics. He tracked down Rosetans who had moved away from the town to other parts of the country. Their heart attack rates went right back up to normal. It wasn't in their blood. Maybe it was the region. He studied the two neighboring towns, Bangor and Nazareth, just a few miles down the road. Same water, same air, same doctors. Their heart disease rates were 3 times higher than Roseto's. So what was it? Wolf finally realized, after nearly a decade of research, that the answer wasn't in the people of Roseto. It was in the town itself. In Roseto, 3 generations of a family lived under one roof. Grandparents mattered. Grandparents were listened to. People walked down the street and stopped 20 times to chat in Italian. They cooked together. They gathered in the piazza in the evenings. There were 22 civic organizations in a town of under 2,000 people. Nobody was ever alone. Nobody was ever left behind. Nobody felt invisible. The Rostons weren't healthy because of what they ate or what they did. They were healthy because of who they had. They had each other. Wolf was making a radical claim for medical science in 1960. He was saying that the cure for heart disease might not be a pill or a diet. It might be a community. It might be the invisible web of relationships that we can barely see, let alone measure. And that's the moment this book begins. Because Gladwell looked at Rosetto and saw something bigger than a medical mystery. He saw a framework, a way of thinking. What if the thing that makes a person successful is the same kind of thing that made the Rositans healthy? Not something you can see if you just look at the person. Something you only see if you pull the camera back and back and back until you're looking at their family, their neighborhood, their generation, their culture, the decade they were born into. What if success, like health, is a story you can only understand from the outside? That's the question this entire book is built on. Now let's start answering it. Part 1. Opportunity. Chapter 1. The Matthew Effect. In May of 2007, 2 of the best junior hockey teams in Canada met in Vancouver for the Memorial Cup. This is the championship of the finest junior hockey league in the world. These are the future NHL stars, 17, 18, 19 years old, kids who have been skating since before they could walk. The stadium was packed. The Canadian national television audience was in the millions. Gordie Howe himself, one of the legends of the game, was there to drop the puck. It was a great game. Vancouver won 3-1, and then a psychologist named Roger Barnsley would have done what he always did when he watched Canadian junior hockey. He'd have opened the team rosters and started scanning the birthdays, because Roger Barnsley knew something about Canadian hockey that would break your brain. In the 1980s, Barnsley had been watching a junior hockey game with his wife when he noticed something weird about the player roster. Almost all the best players seemed to have been born in the same few months. He thought he was imagining it, so he went home and checked the numbers. He wasn't imagining it. In any elite hockey league in Canada, 40% of the players will have been born between January and March. 30% will have been born between April and June, 20% between July and September, and just 10% between October and December. Let me say that again. If you take the top hockey players in an entire country, you are 4 times more likely to have been born in the first 3 months of the year than the last 3. What? The first time you hear this, it sounds like a joke, like a cute statistical oddity, some trivia fact. But Barnsley kept looking, and the pattern wasn't just a Canadian hockey thing. It was in European soccer. It was in American baseball. It was in any competitive youth sport, where kids got sorted by age. Here's why. In Canadian hockey, the cutoff date for age-based leagues is January 1st. That means a kid born on January 2nd is, for league purposes, the same age as a kid born the following December 31st. On paper, they're both 9-year-olds, but one of them has had nearly an entire year of additional growth. More muscle, more coordination, more confidence. So when the coaches come to evaluate the 9-year-olds for the traveling all-star team, the team that gets the better coaching, the more ice time, the longer season, who do they pick? They pick the bigger kids, the stronger kids, the faster kids, which at 9 years old just means the older kids. The kid born in January gets onto the elite team. The kid born in December doesn't. And from that moment forward, their paths diverge. The kid on the elite team gets better coaching, more practice, more games, against better competition. By the time they're 13, the gap isn't about birthdays anymore. The January kid really is better. He's had 4 more years of serious hockey development than the December kid. He's not a better athlete. He's a better trained athlete. but you can't tell the difference anymore from the outside, and so he gets selected for the next level, and the next, and the next, until 15 years after a coach made a decision based on who looked bigger when they were 9. There he is, skating in the Memorial Cup in front of millions of people, being called gifted, being called talented, being called a natural. He's not a natural. He's the product of a birthday. Gladwell calls this the Matthew effect, after a verse in the Gospel of Matthew. For unto everyone that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance. But from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath. In plain English, the rich get richer, and the poor get poorer. A small advantage given at the right time compounds, and a small disadvantage given at the same time also compounds. And 20 years later, you are looking at two lives that don't look anything alike, and you are telling yourself a story about talent and grit and drive, when what you're actually looking at is the result of a cutoff date nobody questioned. Now think about that for a minute. What if this isn't just hockey? Because it isn't. There's a study by 2 economists at the National Bureau of Economic Research. They looked at the cutoff dates for school enrollment in America. In most states, a child has to turn 5 by a certain date, usually in the summer or fall, to enroll in kindergarten that year, which means in any given kindergarten class, some kids are nearly 6 when school starts, and some are barely 5. The gap between a 5-year-old and a 6-year-old at that age is enormous. The older kids read earlier, they focus longer, they're more confident, so they get put into the reading groups for the strong readers. They get more attention. They start to believe they're smart because the adults around them keep telling them so. By 4th grade, these same kids are so far ahead that a researcher studying 4th grade test scores would find a huge gap between the oldest kids and the youngest kids in the class. By high school, the older kids are twice as likely to be in gifted and talented programs. When it comes time to apply to college, they're significantly more likely to go to a 4-year school. One study found that among the top quartile of students in math and science in American high schools, the oldest kids in the class outnumbered the youngest kids by a margin you could not explain away. A decision was made when they were 5. They didn't know it, their parents barely knew it. The teacher who put them in the top reading group didn't know she was changing their entire educational trajectory. But the decision compounded and compounded and compounded. We look at a successful 40-year-old and we think, what a driven person, what a hard worker. But a lot of the time what we're actually seeing is a 5-year-old who got lucky with a birthday and then spent the next 3 decades on the compound interest plan. Now here's the part that I think matters most. We do this as a society on purpose. We take kids at 5 or 9 or 11 and we sort them. We call the ones who are ahead gifted. We put more resources into them. We give them more attention. And we tell ourselves we're rewarding merit. But what if a lot of what we call merit is just the echo of a sorting decision that was made when our brains were still forming? What if the people we think we're rewarding for their effort are really just the people who happen to be on the right side of a line someone drew by accident? This is the first big idea of Outliers. Success is not a single event. It's an accumulation, and the accumulation starts early, much earlier than we think, and it runs on a brutal, beautiful logic. The ones who get a tiny bit ahead early get a little more opportunity, and that tiny bit of extra opportunity turns into a small skill advantage, and that small skill advantage gets them selected for the next round, and the next round brings more opportunity, and so on for 30 years. A single good break given at the right time can echo forward through a whole life. But if that's true, then a bad break at the same time can echo just as loudly. And most people who didn't make it never find out why. So if a little opportunity given early can echo for 30 years, what happens when a person gets a massive amount of it? Chapter 2. The 10,000 hour rule. Let me tell you a story about a teenager named Bill Joy. In the fall of 1971, Bill Joy walked onto the campus of the University of Michigan. He was 16 years old. He was skinny, awkward, brilliant. He had a perfect math SAT score. His original plan was to become a biologist, or maybe a mathematician, but in his first week at Michigan, Bill Joy stumbled into a building on Beale Avenue that would change his life. The Computer Center, a brand new building with a vast white room inside it, filled with enormous mainframe computers that looked, as one person described it, like the last scene of 2001, A Space Odyssey. Now in 1971, computers were the size of refrigerators. If you were a college student who wanted to use one, you had to punch your program onto a stack of paper cards and hand them to the operator, who would run your program hours or days later and give you back a printout. One mistake, you had to start over. It was slow, tedious, expensive, and exclusive. But the University of Michigan had just done something radical. They had switched to a time-sharing system, which meant students could type directly at a terminal and get real-time feedback. It was a magical thing, and Bill Joy discovered it, and he fell in love, and he never stopped programming. He'd go to the computer center at 8 in the evening and not leave until 8 in the morning. He'd skip classes. He'd teach himself languages the professors weren't teaching. He'd find bugs in the system and just start fixing them. He later told Gladwell, "I think I programmed for 8 or 10 hours a day, every day, for years." By the time he got to graduate school at Berkeley, Bill Joy was rewriting the code of the Unix operating system. He essentially helped create the architecture of the modern internet. Today, if you use the internet, you are in some way walking through buildings he helped construct. He is arguably one of the most important programmers of the last 50 years. And the story we love to tell about Bill Joy is that he was a genius, a prodigy, a natural. But that's not the whole story. A psychologist named K. Anders Ericsson spent years studying what actually separates elite performers from everyone else. He studied violinists at the Berlin Academy of Music. He studied chess grandmasters. He studied pianists, athletes, surgeons, writers. He asked a simple question: what do the best of the best have in common? And his answer wasn't what you'd expect. Ericsson looked at those Berlin violin students, and he divided them into 3 groups based on ability: the future world-class soloists, the good professionals, and the ones who'd probably end up as music teachers. He asked each of them a single question: how many hours have you practiced in your life? The answer was breathtaking. By the age of 20, the future soloists had practiced 10,000 hours. The good professionals had practiced 8,000. The teachers had practiced 4,000. The striking thing wasn't that the top students had practiced more. You'd expect that. The striking thing wasn't that nobody in the top group had gotten there on less than 10,000 hours of practice. There were no naturals. There were no people who'd floated to the top on talent alone. Every single elite violinist had put in roughly the same enormous quantity of deliberate, focused work. Ericsson looked at field after field: composers, chess players, programmers. The number that kept showing up was the same: 10,000 hours. Roughly 10 years of deliberate practice to achieve mastery at a world-class level. Now listen carefully, because the next thing I'm going to say is what most people miss. 10,000 hours is an enormous amount of time. If you practice 3 hours a day, every single day with no days off, it takes you about 10 years to get there. Most people don't have 3 hours a day. Most adults certainly don't. Most children definitely don't. So here's the question: which teenagers in America in the 1960s and 70s had the opportunity to program computers for 10,000 hours before they turned 20? The answer is almost none of them. Computers were rare. Programming time was expensive, unless you were one of the tiny handful of kids who just happened to stumble into exactly the right situation: a time-sharing terminal, a forgiving university, parents who didn't make you come home at midnight. You couldn't get anywhere close to 10,000 hours. Now let me tell you about another teenager from the same era. His name was Bill Gates. In 1968, when Bill Gates was 13 years old, his parents decided to pull him out of public school and send him to Lakeside, a private school in Seattle. That year, the Lakeside Mothers Club held a rummage sale and used the proceeds to buy the school something almost no school in the world had in 1968, a computer terminal, a direct connection terminal to a mainframe in downtown Seattle. In 1968, there were maybe a few dozen American high schools with computer access, and Bill Gates was at one of them. Now think about that. At 13, Bill Gates could walk into the computer room at his school and write code on a real working terminal. The university students who would later come into his life were getting their first taste of this same technology when they were 19 or 20. Gates had 6 years on them before they even started, and he didn't stop there. When he used up the school's computer time, he found a company in Seattle called C-Cubed that let him use their computers at night for free in exchange for finding bugs. When that company went broke, he found ISI, Information Sciences Incorporated, which let him use their machine in exchange for writing a payroll program. He started sneaking out of his parents' house at 3 in the morning, walking down the hill, and programming until dawn at the University of Washington Computer Lab. By the time Bill Gates dropped out of Harvard to start Microsoft, he had been programming continuously, obsessively, for 7 consecutive years, far more than 10,000 hours. How many other teenagers in the world had that opportunity in 1975? Gladwell estimates maybe 50. Gates was a genius. He was also unbelievably driven. Those things are true. But the story we usually tell about him leaves out the part where a wealthy private school just happened to have a terminal, where his parents just happened to let him stay out all night programming, where he just happened to live within walking distance of a major research university with computers he could use, where he was just the right age when the personal computer revolution started, too young to be locked into an old-fashioned career, too old to miss the opening entirely. Take any of those pieces out, and there is no Microsoft. Here's the thing about Gladwell's argument, and I want to be careful here. He is not saying that Bill Gates and Bill Joy and the Beatles weren't talented. They obviously were. He is not saying talent doesn't matter. It does. He is saying that talent alone is nowhere near enough. You could be the most gifted violinist ever born, but if you cannot get access to 10,000 hours of practice, you will never be a world-class violinist. Somebody with less natural talent who got the hours will beat you every time. Now here's the last piece of this puzzle. Let me tell you about the Beatles. In 1960, the Beatles were a failing high school band from Liverpool. They had a small following. They had a few gigs. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison. At this point, they were not remarkable. They were okay. And then a German club owner named Bruno Koschmider came to Liverpool looking for bands to fill the stages of his strip clubs in Hamburg. And the Beatles said yes. And off they went to Germany. Here's what nobody ever tells you about the Beatles. In Hamburg, they played for 8 hours a night, sometimes longer, 7 nights a week, for weeks and weeks at a time. Think about what that means. Most bands in Liverpool played a 1-hour set on a Saturday night. The Beatles in Hamburg were playing 8 1-hour sets back to back, every single night for months. John Lennon described it later. He said, "In Liverpool, we'd only ever done 1-hour sessions, and we'd always just do the same songs every time. In Hamburg, we had to play for 8 hours, so we had to find a new way to play. We got better and we got more confidence. We couldn't help it with all the experience playing all night long." The Beatles made 5 trips to Hamburg between 1960 and 1962. On those 5 trips, they played 270 nights. By the time they had their first burst of success in 1964, they had performed live an estimated 1,200 times. Most bands today don't perform 1,200 times in their entire career. The Beatles didn't explode onto the world fully formed. The Beatles spent their invisible years being rebuilt, 8 hours at a time on the stages of German strip clubs, while nobody was watching. And that is the deep truth of the 10,000 hours. The people we call geniuses, the Beatles and Bill Gates and Bill Joy, didn't skip the work. They put the work in. What made them different wasn't that they didn't need the hours. It's that they were somehow given, by timing, by circumstance, by birth, an opportunity to do the hours that almost nobody else got. So when you look at a genius, don't just see the genius. Look for the strip club in Hamburg. Look for the rummage sale that bought the computer. Look for the parents who let the 13-year-old stay up all night coding, because somewhere in every outlier story, there is an opportunity hiding, and the opportunity is often the real hero. So far, we've talked about opportunity, the birthdays, the decades, the rummage sales. But there's a question lurking underneath all of this. What about intelligence? Because surely, if you're smart enough, none of this matters. If your IQ is high enough, if your brain is good enough, you should be able to overcome any disadvantage, right? The next story I'm going to tell you will convince you otherwise, because it is about the smartest man in America, and about why you have never heard his name. Chapter 3. The Trouble with Geniuses. In the 1950s, an American TV game show called the $64,000 Question was a national sensation. Contestants would walk into an isolation booth, the lights would dim, and they would answer progressively harder trivia questions for larger and larger sums of money. One of the most famous contestants was a 10-year-old boy named Michael Kearney. Michael had been reading at age 10 months. He graduated from college at 10 years old. By his early 20s, he had multiple master's degrees. That kind of child prodigy, the kind who makes the front page of the newspaper, haunts our culture. We love these stories. The impossibly smart kid who grows up to change the world. But here's the strange thing. If you actually follow what happens to these kids, the story doesn't go the way you'd expect. In the 1920s, a Stanford psychologist named Lewis Terman had the same fascination. He believed that if you could identify the geniuses early, you could track their rise. He believed that intelligence measured accurately was the single greatest predictor of human achievement. So Terman launched one of the most ambitious studies in the history of psychology. He scoured California elementary schools, gave IQ tests to thousands of children, and identified the top of the top, 1,500 of them, kids with IQs over 140, some over 200. He called them his termites, and he followed them for the rest of their lives. What would these geniuses become? Nobel laureates? World-changing inventors? Celebrated artists? Not really. Decades later, when Terman's termites were middle-aged, here's what he found. Some had become doctors and lawyers. Some had become professors. A handful were successful, but most were just regular, middle-class professionals living unremarkable lives. A number of them were what Terman delicately called disappointments, janitors, dropouts, men and women who had done nothing particularly interesting with their gifts. The termites, as a group, produced 0 Nobel laureates. 0. Meanwhile, 2 kids who had been tested for the study and rejected for having IQs that weren't high enough, Luis Alvarez and William Shockley, both went on to win the Nobel Prize in physics. How is that possible? Terman's mistake was a beautiful mistake. He assumed that intelligence worked like height in basketball, that more of it was always better, that a 7'6" player is necessarily more dominant than a 7-footer. But intelligence doesn't work that way. Here's what researchers have discovered since. Above a certain threshold, somewhere around an IQ of 120, additional IQ points stop mattering very much. A person with an IQ of 170 is not meaningfully more likely to win a Nobel Prize than a person with an IQ of 130. Once you cross the threshold of being smart enough, the rest of your success depends on other things entirely. This is counterintuitive, so let me say it a different way. IQ is like height in basketball. Yes, you need to be tall enough to play, You probably need to be at least 6 feet. But once you cross that threshold, does being 7'2" make you a better player than someone who's 6'6"? No. At that point, it's about footwork, about vision, about toughness, about the 10,000 other things that have nothing to do with height. Above the threshold, the question stops being how smart are you and starts being what did you do with the mind you have? Which brings us to Chris Langan. Chris Langan is, by most measures, the smartest man in America. His IQ has been tested at 195. Einstein's is estimated around 150. Langan started talking at 6 months. He taught himself to read at 3. He could write in multiple languages as a child. He once grabbed a Princeton Review study book for the SAT, read it once, and walked in and got a perfect score while falling asleep during the exam. By every measure of raw horsepower, Chris Langan should be one of the most consequential thinkers alive. And yet, as of the time Gladwell wrote this book, Chris Langan was working as a bouncer at a bar on Long Island and a manual laborer on a horse farm in Missouri. He had no degree. He had never published a paper. Nobody in academia knew his name. How does that happen? Here's the story. Langan grew up desperately poor. His stepfather was violent. His mother was overwhelmed. He won a scholarship to Reed College in Oregon when he was 18, and he went. And that's where his life started to break down in a way that, once you hear it, you'll never forget. His mother was supposed to fill out a single financial aid form to renew his scholarship each year. She didn't, or she did and didn't mail it, or it got lost. Nobody quite knows. What is known is that Langan showed up for sophomore year to discover that his scholarship was gone. He had no money. He had no parents to call. He had no idea how to fix it. He dropped out. A few years later, he tried again. He enrolled at Montana State University. He was taking classes, working a construction job on the side, sleeping a few hours a night. One winter morning, his car broke down. The transmission wouldn't shift out of reverse. He called the registrar and asked if he could move his class schedule from 8 in the morning to the afternoon so he could carpool with another student. The registrar said no. He went to the dean. He explained the situation. He explained the scholarship. He explained the broken car. He explained that he was trying, that he just needed this one thing. The dean said no. Chris Langan left the office, went home, and dropped out of college for the second and final time. He was 20 years old. He had the highest IQ in America, and the system twice in 2 different states had looked at him and said, no. Now stop and think for a moment. Can you imagine the son of a wealthy family in that situation? Can you imagine a child who had been raised by, say, 2 professionals in a Connecticut suburb in that exact situation? That kid would not have dropped out. That kid's mother would have been on the phone with the dean every day. That kid's father would have written a letter, pulled a string, flown out to campus, made it work. That kid would have been taught since he could speak that systems are things you negotiate with, that authority figures are people you address, that when you need something, you ask for it clearly, and you don't take no for an answer. Chris Langan had never been taught any of that. There's a concept sociologists use for this. It's called practical intelligence, and it's different from analytical intelligence. Analytical intelligence is what we measure with an IQ test. Can you solve this puzzle? Can you detect this pattern? Can you process this information? Practical intelligence is something else. Practical intelligence is knowing what to say to whom, and when, and how. It's knowing how to navigate a conversation with a dean, knowing how to frame a request so it gets granted, knowing that when authority says no, you don't just accept it. You ask for the decision maker. You escalate. You explain. You push. Practical intelligence is not inherited in your genes. It's taught. It's absorbed from your family. It's learned by watching how your parents interact with the world. And Chris Langan had not been taught it. A sociologist named Annette Lareau spent years studying how middle-class parents and working-class parents raise their children, and what she found was extraordinary. Middle-class parents, she said, engage in what she calls concerted cultivation. They schedule their kids, they reason with them, they argue with their kids' teachers, they intervene with authority figures, they teach their kids from the time they can talk that they have a right to make their case, that the world is something to be engaged with, shaped, negotiated. Working class parents, not because they love their children any less, but because their lives have taught them differently, tend to practice what she calls the accomplishment of natural growth. The children are loved, fed, kept safe, but the kids are largely left to develop on their own. They don't see their parents arguing with doctors, with teachers, with administrators. They absorb instead a sense that institutions are powerful and the individual is small. Which of those two children do you think walks into a dean's office at 20 years old and successfully argues for a schedule change? This is what Chris Langan didn't have. A 195 IQ, fluent in multiple languages, could read before he was 4, but nobody had ever taught him how to ask. Now contrast that with Robert Oppenheimer. When Robert Oppenheimer was a graduate student at Cambridge University, he had a mental breakdown. He was a young American trying to do experimental physics in a lab he wasn't suited for, and his rage at his tutor, a brilliant and demanding physicist named Patrick Blackett, grew unbearable. So one day, Robert Oppenheimer did something almost unthinkable. He tried to poison his tutor. He took chemicals from the lab, laced an apple with them, and left it on Blackett's desk. The tutor didn't eat the apple, but the attempt was discovered. Oppenheimer was called in. He was expected to be expelled, possibly prosecuted. Instead, his parents flew in. They negotiated, they bargained, they argued. His father, a wealthy New York art collector, worked the system, and the university agreed. Oppenheimer would be put on probation. He would see a psychiatrist. He would not be expelled. He would not be prosecuted. A decade later, this same man would be running the Manhattan Project, building the atomic bomb, directing thousands of scientists, shaping the course of the 20th century. Chris Langan lost his scholarship because his mother didn't fill out a form. Robert Oppenheimer literally tried to poison somebody and still got handed the atomic bomb. What's the difference? It's not brains, it's not drive, it's not character. Chris Langan is every bit as brilliant and in many ways just as ambitious. The difference is that Oppenheimer was raised inside a family and a class and a world that taught him, bone deep, that rules are negotiable, that authority can be persuaded, that when the world tells you no, you gather your resources and convince the world to change its mind. And Chris Langan was raised in a world that told him, over and over, that the answer is just no. Gladwell's argument here is brutal. It's not that intelligence doesn't matter. Of course it does. But intelligence by itself is nothing. It's an engine with no steering. To turn a high IQ into a great life, you need a second thing, the knowledge of how to work the world. And that knowledge is mostly taught by the family you were born into. If you were lucky enough to be raised by parents who taught you, from the time you could talk, how to speak up, how to argue, how to navigate authority, you probably don't even notice it. It's like asking a fish about water. It's everywhere. It's invisible. It's just how life is. But if you weren't, if you grew up in a family where nobody ever taught you those things, then you are walking through the world with a handicap that nobody will ever acknowledge, because everyone around you assumes that everyone has it. This is the second big idea of Outliers. Raw ability doesn't float to the top by itself. It has to be translated. And the translators are the people who raised you. Chris Langan was given the Ferrari. Nobody gave him the keys, which raises a question. If family and class mattered this much, then what would happen if every single part of your family story was stacked against you? What if you came from a group that was locked out of every professional career, pushed into the worst jobs, kept at the bottom for generations? You'd assume those people would stay at the bottom. But what if they didn't? What if the very thing that looked like the biggest disadvantage turned out to be the hidden advantage? Chapter 4. The 3 Lessons of Joe Flom. If you walk into the gleaming skyscrapers of Midtown Manhattan today, and ask who the most powerful lawyers in America are, a name you're going to hear over and over is Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meagher, and Flom. It's one of the largest law firms in the world. Thousands of attorneys, billions in revenue, the kind of place where a senior partner's annual income has more commas than yours has digits. The Flom in that name is Joe Flom, and his story, in Gladwell's hands, is one of the great accidental detective stories in all of business history. Joe Flom was born in 1923 in the depths of the Depression. His parents were Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. They lived in a brutal tenement neighborhood in Brooklyn. His father sewed shoulder pads in the garment district for wages that barely kept the family fed. His mother did piecework at home. Joe, from the time he was tiny, was scrappy. He sold Christmas cards door to door as a small boy to earn money. He worked every summer. He was brilliant, sharp-tongued, impatient. He talked his way into the Harvard Law School class of 1948 without actually having finished his undergraduate degree. He had gone into the army in the middle of college and convinced Harvard to take him anyway. Now in 1948, the year Joe Flom graduated from Harvard Law School, here is what happened to most Jewish kids who graduated from Harvard Law School. They didn't get the jobs they deserved. The big, prestigious, white-shoe law firms of Manhattan, Sullivan and Cromwell, Cravath, Swain and Moore, Davis Polk, those firms didn't hire Jewish lawyers. They didn't hire Italian lawyers. They didn't hire black lawyers or women. They hired white Anglo-Saxon Protestants from the right families who had gone to the right schools. Everyone knew the rules. Nobody said them out loud. So in 1948, Joe Flom, top of his Harvard class, brilliant legal mind, hungry and driven, could not get hired at a white shoe firm. He and a few other outcast Jewish lawyers from his generation ended up cobbling together their own little firms, taking the cases nobody else wanted, representing the clients the big firms wouldn't touch. Here's the work that was considered beneath the dignity of a real lawyer in 1950s New York: corporate takeovers, hostile acquisitions, proxy fights, the messy, rough business of one company trying to swallow another company against its will. That was seen as ungentlemanly, unseemly, dirty. The respectable firms wanted nothing to do with it. Joe Flom and his generation of Jewish outsider lawyers, they took that work. It was the only work they could get. They became experts in something nobody else wanted to be an expert in. And then the world changed. In the 1970s and 80s, the American economy transformed. Hostile corporate takeovers, which had been a dirty backwater of the legal world, suddenly became the main event. The big takeover battles of that era, the leveraged buyouts, the hostile raids, the mergers and acquisitions, rewrote American business. And every single one of those battles needed specialized legal expertise. And who in all of New York City knew how to do this work? Who had been grinding at it for 30 years while everyone else looked down their nose at it? Who had relationships, expertise, experience, instincts, and a whole firm built around it? Joe Flom. And the old white shoe firms that had refused to hire him in 1948. Their senior partners, the grandsons of the men who wouldn't let him in the door, were now calling Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meagher, and Flom, begging for help. The very prejudice that had locked Joe Flom out of the mainstream became the foundation of his empire. But here's where Gladwell's story gets really interesting, because Joe Flom's success wasn't just a twist of fate. There were 3 invisible advantages stacked behind him that made it possible. And those 3 advantages are a perfect illustration of what this whole book is about. First advantage, Joe Flom was Jewish, and he happened to come of age at exactly the right moment for that to be a gift instead of a curse. Here's what most people don't know about the legal profession in America. Up until around 1970, it was an Anglo-Saxon club. The prestigious work, big corporate clients, white shoe firms, respectable litigation, was reserved for the insiders. Everyone else got scraps. But those scraps, hostile takeovers in particular, turned out to be where all the money eventually went. The Jewish outsider lawyers who were forced into that work were, by sheer luck of timing, positioned to own the future of American law. The takeover wave arrived. Billions of dollars flowed through their firms. The outsiders became the insiders. If Joe Flom had been born 20 years earlier, hostile takeovers wouldn't have existed when he was in his prime. If he had been born 20 years later, the big firms would have already moved in on the work. He was born at exactly the right moment. Second advantage, a demographic accident. In the early 1930s, American birth rates collapsed. The Depression was so brutal, so terrifying, that people stopped having babies. The birth rate fell by 25%. A generation of children that wasn't born. Now think about what that meant for a kid born in 1923. In the thin sliver of the last generation before the collapse, Joe Flom's generation was smaller than the one before it, and much smaller than the one after it. His class sizes in school were tiny. Teachers had time for him. College spots were wide open. Jobs were abundant when he graduated because there weren't enough young lawyers to fill them. Everything about being born in 1923 was a competitive advantage relative to being born in, say, 1935 or 1955. Joe Flom didn't choose his birth year. Neither did any of the other Jewish outsider lawyers who rose with him, but their birth years chose them. A whole generation of ambitious kids got an open door because the door wasn't crowded. Third advantage, the garment industry. Joe Flom's father sewed shoulder pads. Louis Borgenicht, another Jewish immigrant of that era, started with one apron and built a clothing empire. A whole generation of Eastern European Jewish immigrants came through Ellis Island and ended up in the needle trades, sewing, cutting, selling, making clothes. Most immigrant groups at that time came from agricultural backgrounds. They were peasants, farmers, laborers. When they arrived in America, they moved into unskilled industrial work. But the Jewish immigrants arriving from places like Lithuania, Poland, and Russia brought something different with them. They had been shopkeepers, they had been craftsmen, they had been tailors. They arrived in America with what Gladwell calls meaningful work in their hands, work where you could see the connection between your effort and your reward, where you were your own boss, where every stitch you sewed belonged to you. That mattered enormously for their children. Because growing up in a home where your parents did meaningful work teaches you, wordlessly every day, that work can be a source of identity and pride, rather than just a way to survive. The children of garment workers grew up watching their parents use their hands and their minds to build something, and they absorbed, without anyone ever saying it, the idea that hard work leads somewhere. The children of Jewish garment workers became doctors and lawyers and professors at a rate that was almost statistically impossible, given their starting point in America. Not because of IQ, not because of some cultural mystique, but because meaningful work, done by parents, produces ambitious children. Now pull the camera back. Look at Joe Flom. He was Jewish, born into a community that had been forced into the only work that would later become the most valuable work in American law. He was born in the demographic trough that gave him an open lane to the top. He was raised by parents who did meaningful autonomous work that taught him, without a single lesson being spoken, that hard work meant something. And he was placed in New York City in the 1940s, the greatest city in the world at exactly the right moment in its history. You can tell the story of Joe Flom's life as a rags to riches fable. A poor immigrant kid who worked harder than everyone else and willed himself to the top. Or you can tell it like Gladwell does. You can say that Joe Flom was the product of 4 separate historical forces that all lined up behind him, and that if any of those 4 things had been different, he would never have become the lawyer who reshaped American law. Both stories are true, but we only ever tell the first one. And that's the lesson of Joe Flom. It isn't enough to have talent. It isn't enough to have drive. It isn't even enough to have access to the 10,000 hours. You also need to live in a moment where the work you've learned to do is the work the world is about to want. The Outliers didn't just beat the system. They found themselves standing exactly where the system was about to arrive. So far, we've talked about opportunity, birthdays, hours, family, generation, all of it focused on the outside story, the things the world does to us. But what about the inside story? What about the things we carry with us without even knowing it? Gladwell's second half of the book is about something harder to see and harder to accept. He calls it legacy, the idea that we are not just the products of our own lives. We are the inheritors of lives lived hundreds of years ago by people we never met, in places we've never been, and the ghosts of those lives are still pulling the strings inside us. I know that sounds abstract, so let me take you to a place called Harlan, Kentucky. Part 2, Legacy, Chapter 5, Harlan, Kentucky. Harlan County, Kentucky was founded in 1819 by 8 immigrant families. They were Scotch-Irish, descendants of the people who had lived for centuries on the border between Scotland and England, then moved to Northern Ireland, then crossed the ocean to America. They settled in the Appalachian Mountains because the land was rough and isolated and cheap, and it reminded them of home. And almost as soon as they arrived, they started killing each other. Let me tell you one specific story. In the 1880s, in the town of Harlan, there were 2 families, the Howards and the Turners. They'd lived near each other for decades. They went to the same church. They married each other's cousins. And then one day in 1882, for reasons nobody fully understood, one of the Howards and one of the Turners got into an argument. Over what? Nobody's entirely sure. Something small, a debt, a slight, a misunderstanding. The argument turned into a fight. The fight turned into a shooting, and the shooting turned into a war. Over the next 10 years, 18 people in those 2 families were killed. 18. In a county of a few thousand people. Fathers, sons, brothers, cousins, they hunted each other through the hollers. They ambushed each other on mountain roads. Every funeral became the spark for the next killing. The feud didn't end when somebody apologized. The feud ended when there was almost nobody left to kill. Now here's what makes this story more than just a curiosity from Kentucky history. The Howard-Turner feud wasn't unique. It wasn't even unusual. If you go through the newspaper archives of Eastern Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, the Western Virginia Highlands, you will find dozens of these feuds, maybe hundreds. The Hatfields and McCoys is just the most famous. They were everywhere, and for a long time, historians didn't have a good explanation. Why this region? Why these people? Why this level of violence over what looked, from the outside, like almost nothing, until 2 social psychologists at the University of Michigan figured it out. Their names were Dove Cohen and Richard Nisbet, and in the early 1990s, they ran a now famous experiment. They recruited young men, college students at the University of Michigan, and brought them into the lab one at a time. Some of the young men were from the north, some were from the south. They were told they were going to take a test, and they needed to drop off a form at the end of a long, narrow hallway. As the young man walked down the hallway, an actor, planted by the researchers, would be standing at a filing cabinet, blocking the path. The young man would have to squeeze past, and as he did, the actor would slam the drawer shut, bump into the young man, and mutter a single word under his breath. The word was asshole. The actor would then walk away, and the researchers would measure what happened inside the young man next. Here's what they found. The young men from the north, the ones raised in places like Michigan and New York and Ohio, they mostly shrugged it off. They thought the guy was rude. They got a little annoyed. Their hormone levels barely changed. They went about their day. But the young men from the south, the ones raised in Kentucky, Alabama, Tennessee, the Carolinas, something very different happened in their bodies. Their cortisol levels, the stress hormone, spiked. Their testosterone levels, the aggression hormone, spiked. Their handshakes afterward became crushing. They were, measurably, physiologically, preparing for violence, same insult, same situation, same young American men, completely different internal responses. Why? Cohen and Nisbet had a theory, and it goes all the way back to the ancestors of those young men. The south of the United States was settled disproportionately by Scotch-Irish immigrants, the same people who settled Harlan County, and these were people who had come from what sociologists call a herding culture. Here's why that matters. If you're a farmer and a stranger comes onto your land, they can't really steal much. Your crops are in the ground, your field is your field. Farming cultures don't need a huge concept of personal honor to protect their livelihood, because the land protects itself. But herding is different. If you're a shepherd on a lonely hillside, and a man comes up the path with a rifle, he can take your entire flock in a single afternoon. Everything you own, everything your family owns, gone. And nobody's coming to help you because you're out on a hillside in the middle of nowhere. In a herding culture, if you don't establish from the very first day that you are not to be messed with, that any slight, any insult, any challenge will be met with overwhelming force, you will lose everything. Your reputation for toughness is your only insurance policy. So herding cultures everywhere in the world develop what anthropologists call cultures of honor. Men are expected to be touchy, to take offense, to respond to small slights with disproportionate violence. Not because they're broken, because they're rational. The Scotch-Irish came from the border country between Scotland and England. They had been herders for 1,000 years. They brought the culture of honor with them to Northern Ireland. They brought it from there to the Appalachian Highlands of America, and their children, and their grandchildren, and their great-great-great-grandchildren carried it forward, generation after generation, long after the herds were gone, long after the hillsides were replaced by coal mines and highways and shopping malls. By the time Cohen and Nisbet bumped those college students in a hallway in 1991, most of those young men had never seen a sheep in their lives. Their ancestors' herding world was 3 centuries and 3,000 miles away, but the culture was still inside them. When somebody called them an asshole and bumped into them, their bodies, for reasons they could not have articulated, prepared to fight. That is what cultural legacy means. It is an inheritance that lives in the body, in the reflexes, in the stress response, in the way you hear the word asshole whispered in a hallway. It does not ask your permission. It does not wait for you to agree with it. It just runs. And the Howards and the Turners of Harlan County, Kentucky, were not crazy when they killed 18 of each other's family members over a forgotten slight in 1882. They were doing what their ancestors had been doing on the border of Scotland for 1,000 years. Now here's the question Gladwell asks, and it's the question that makes this chapter important. If a cultural inheritance from 300 years ago can make a college student's cortisol spike when he's insulted, what else is it doing? What other ancient legacies are running inside the people around you right now? Inside you? The answer, as it turns out, can be the difference between life and death. Chapter 6. The Ethnic Theory of Plane Crashes. On a clear January night in 1990, an Avianca flight from Columbia to New York circled over Kennedy Airport, waiting for permission to land. The plane was running low on fuel, very low. The first officer, a young Colombian pilot named Mauricio Klotz, knew it. The captain knew it. Air traffic control did not know it. Here's a normal fact about aviation. Every pilot in the world is trained from their first day that if the fuel is getting dangerously low, you declare a fuel emergency. Those are the magic words, fuel emergency. You say it, and air traffic control clears the airspace. They bring you in immediately. Lives are saved. Captain Laureano Cavitas did not declare a fuel emergency, and First Officer Klotz, who knew they were in desperate trouble, never forced the issue. Listen to the actual cockpit voice recording. The first officer's communications with the tower, which were recovered from the crash site, are agonizing. The controller tells them to hold. Klotz responds with a polite, mild, almost apologetic acknowledgement. The controller tells them they're being routed around. Klotz says okay. At no point does he say the magic words. At no point does he say, "We are out of fuel." At no point does he say, "We cannot wait." At no point does he force air traffic control to act. The plane ran out of fuel. It crashed into a hillside in Cove Neck, Long Island. 73 people died. Why did a trained pilot, who knew the phrase that would have saved his life, refuse to say it? Now skip ahead to 1997. Korean Air Flight 801, a Boeing 747 with 254 people on board, was making an approach into Guam. The weather was bad, rain, low clouds. The glide slope instrument on the runway, which helps pilots line up for landing, was out of service that night. The captain, who had been flying for 8 hours and was visibly exhausted, began the descent. The first officer, a much younger pilot, noticed that something was wrong. The plane was coming in too low. The conditions were dangerous. By every rule of airline safety, the first officer should have clearly and forcefully alerted the captain. Listen to what he actually said. "Captain, the weather radar has helped us a lot." Stop for a second. Think about what that sentence is actually trying to communicate. In a Korean cultural context, the specific subtext the first officer was working in, that sentence meant something like this: "Captain, you are relying entirely on your visual approach in conditions where you cannot rely on vision. The weather radar exists. Other information sources exist. Perhaps we should be using them. Perhaps we should not be landing like this." That entire message, that urgent message, was compressed by the first officer into one polite, deferential sentence about how helpful the weather radar has been. The captain, exhausted, did not hear it, or did not process it. The plane continued descending. It struck Nimitz Hill, 3 miles short of the runway. 228 people died. Korean Air, through the 1990s, had one of the worst crash records of any major airline in the world. At one point, Korean Air had a fatal accident rate 17 times higher than United Airlines. 17 times. The airline tried everything. They bought new planes. They retrained their pilots. They brought in consultants. Nothing worked until somebody finally asked the uncomfortable question: what if this isn't about the planes? What if it's about the culture inside the cockpit? Here's what they found. Korean culture, in the specific way it evolved over centuries, is what sociologists call a high power distance culture. What that means is that in Korea, respect for authority, hierarchy, and rank is deeply embedded in everyday life, in the way you speak, in the forms of address you use, in the way a younger person talks to an older person, in the way a junior employee addresses a senior. There are, in the Korean language, different verb endings depending on the social status of the person you're speaking to. Now that is a beautiful, sophisticated cultural inheritance in most contexts. It creates respect. It creates social order. It creates deep hierarchies of apprenticeship and mentorship that have produced extraordinary art, scholarship, and technology in Korea for thousands of years. But put it in a cockpit. In a cockpit, if the first officer sees that the captain is about to fly the plane into a mountain, he needs to say, "Captain, you are about to fly the plane into a mountain." He needs to say clearly. He needs to say it urgently. He needs to raise his voice if necessary. He needs to break every rule of social hierarchy because 254 people are going to die in the next 90 seconds. But the first officer on Korean Air 801 had been raised for 28 years in a culture that told him at a cellular level that he could not speak to his captain that way. It was literally not something his body knew how to do. So he said, "Captain, the weather radar has helped us a lot." And everybody died. Here's the beautiful part of this story. Because it is a beautiful story, Korean Air finally figured out what was going on. They hired a consultant, an American named David Greenberg. And Greenberg did something almost unbelievable. He changed the language of the cockpit. From that point forward, all Korean air pilots were required to speak English, not Korean, when they were flying. Not because English is a better language for aviation, but because English did not carry the cultural weight of hierarchy that Korean did. In English, a first officer could say, "Captain, pull up." And there was no grammatical social punishment for saying it. No verb endings that screamed at him, "You are speaking above your station." English gave the first officers permission, inside their own minds, to warn their captains. The change worked. Korean Air went from one of the worst safety records in aviation to one of the best. Today, it is cited as a global model of airline safety. But notice what had to happen. They had to change the language itself, because the culture was embedded so deeply in the words that the only way to escape it was to leave the language behind. This is what cultural legacy looks like when it kills you. It's not prejudice. It's not ignorance. It's not a lack of training. It is a set of reflexes about how to speak to authority that was laid down in the brains of a people across centuries, and that came to work one day in a cockpit and could not be unlearned in time. Which is why when we study the biggest failures, we can't just study the individual. The individual is carrying more on his shoulders than the individual knows. There are ancestors inside him. There are centuries inside him. And on a rainy night in Guam or a clear night above Long Island, those centuries speak or they stay silent, and the consequences can be catastrophic. But here's the deeper truth Gladwell wants you to understand. If ancient cultural legacies can reach forward through centuries and kill people in cockpits, they can also reach forward and help people. They can make people better at things for reasons that have nothing to do with genes, or intelligence, or effort. Which brings us to one of the most beautiful, strange, and misunderstood ideas in the entire book. Chapter 7. Rice Paddies and Math Tests. If you give a math test to children from around the world, you get a consistent pattern. Children from Japan, South Korea, China, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, they tend to outperform children from almost everywhere else. The gap is large. It has been consistent for decades. And it persists even when you control for income, education, and access to resources. In the West, we have told ourselves a lot of stories about why this is. Some of them, honestly, are borderline racist. Some are about culture and rigor. Some are about tiger parents and endless cram schools. Gladwell has a different answer, and it starts with the way you say numbers. Try this at home. Read the following number out loud. 37. Now say it in your head and hold the sound. You just took about 4 syllables, 37, to say a 2-digit number. Now do the same in Chinese. In Mandarin, 37 is san shi qi, 3 syllables, and the structure of the number is almost mathematical. It literally translates as 3 10 7, 3 tens plus 7. In English, our number words are a mess. 11, 12, 13, 14. These don't follow any clear rule. Why isn't 11 called 1 teen? Why isn't 12 called 2 teen? The English numbers in the teens are historical accidents. They sound different from the numbers below 10 and the numbers above 20. They have to be memorized separately. They're irregular. Chinese numbers, by contrast, are perfectly regular. 10 is 10. 11 is 10-1. 12 is 10-2, 20 is 2 tens, 21 is 2 tens-1. There is no guessing. There is no memorization. The structure of the language just matches the structure of the math. Now here's where it gets extraordinary. Because of the shorter syllables, Chinese-speaking children can hold more numbers in their short-term memory at once than English-speaking children. If I read you a list of 7 or 8 numbers in English and ask you to repeat them back, you'll probably get most of them right. If I read the same list in Chinese to a Chinese speaker, they'll get all of them right. The sounds are shorter, so more of them fit into the memory window. And because the numbers are structured transparently, because 21 is, literally, the word 2 followed by the word 10, followed by the word 1. Arithmetic feels more natural to a Chinese-speaking child. Adding 21 and 32 is easier in Chinese than in English, because the words themselves are already telling you how to do the problem. 2 tens and 3 tens make 5 tens, 1 and 2 make 3, 5 tens and 3, 53. Chinese-speaking children learn to count earlier. They learn to do addition faster. They get a head start of about a year in basic math before they ever sit in a classroom. But that's just the beginning of the story, because there's something bigger going on, something that has nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with centuries of agriculture. In most of the world, traditional farming is about land. If you're growing wheat or corn or rye, you need a lot of land because each individual plant produces a small yield. Western agriculture, for most of history, worked on the principle of expansion. You added more fields, more animals, more equipment. When technology improved, you cut labor. You worked smarter so you could work less. Rice agriculture is completely different. A rice paddy is a small, intensely managed plot of land. You do not expand a rice paddy, you improve it. Rice yields don't increase because you use more land. They increase because you use your existing land more skillfully. Every millimeter of water level matters. Every variety of rice has different timing. Every application of fertilizer has to be judged against what the rice is doing that week. A Chinese rice farmer 1,000 years ago had to make hundreds of small decisions every day about the paddy, and the quality of those decisions determined whether the family ate or starved. And above all, rice farming was brutally labor-intensive. While a European wheat farmer might spend about 1,200 hours a year in the field, a Chinese rice farmer spent close to 3,000 hours a year. A Chinese rice farmer worked more than twice as much as his European counterpart every year for centuries, and the culture that grew up around that work absorbed something very specific, a saying that Gladwell quotes from southern China: "No one who can rise before dawn 360 days a year fails to make his family rich." Listen to that saying. It is not saying hard work will probably pay off. It is not saying, in general, diligence correlates with success. It is saying, if you simply refuse to quit, if you get up before dawn every day, all year, you will succeed. No exceptions. That belief, that ancient cultural inheritance from 1,000 years of rice paddies, is how a lot of East Asian cultures understand effort. Not as one ingredient among many, but as the ingredient, the thing that, applied relentlessly, will eventually beat every obstacle. So when an East Asian child sits down to do a math problem, there is built into the culture around them an assumption that goes something like this: math is hard. Everybody finds it hard. If you sit with it long enough, you will figure it out. The reason you haven't figured it out yet is that you haven't been sitting with it long enough. And when an American child sits down to do the same math problem, the cultural assumption tends to be different. Math is something some people are good at and some people aren't. If you can't solve the problem in 30 seconds, maybe you're just not a math person. Put it down. Try something else. Those two assumptions come from completely different cultural histories. The East Asian assumption comes, in part, from 1,000 years of rice paddies, where relentless effort was the only thing that could save you. The American assumption comes from a very different history, and the two assumptions, invisible to the children holding them, shape how long those children will sit with a hard problem before they give up. There's actually a study that proves this. Psychologists at the University of Pennsylvania designed a test, not a math test, but a test of persistence. They gave children a long, tedious questionnaire, hundreds of boring questions, and they measured not how many a child got right, but how many a child was willing to answer before quitting. The correlation between how many questions a child was willing to answer and that child's math scores was extremely strong. Not perfect, but strong. The kids who answered more questions, who were willing to just keep sitting there, filling in bubble after bubble, tended to be better at math, not because answering questions made them better, but because the same trait that made them willing to grind through the survey also made them willing to grind through a hard math problem. Math ability, at the level of an ordinary student, is less about intelligence than about how long you're willing to sit with a problem before you give up. And so the East Asian advantage in math, which we've been puzzling over for decades, turns out to have almost nothing to do with brains. It has to do with the legacy of number systems that make arithmetic transparent, plus the legacy of an agriculture so punishing that it built a culture around never giving up. Those two inheritances, handed down wordlessly across generations, meet in a classroom and produce an outlier. That is the deep magic of cultural legacy. It is invisible, it is uncredited, but it is running in the background of every life, pushing some people forward and holding others back, for reasons that have nothing to do with the person standing in front of you. And once you see it, once you really see it, you cannot unsee it, because you start to notice it everywhere, in every story of success, in every story of failure. We've been in homestretch territory for a while now. The legacy of Scotch-Irish herders, the legacy of Korean hierarchy, the legacy of rice paddies, all of it invisible, all of it powerful. But there's one more idea I have to tell you about before we close this book. And it is, in some ways, the most hopeful idea in the whole story, because everything we've talked about so far has felt a little bit fatalistic. Your birthday, your generation, your ancestors, the decade you were born in, the rice paddy your great-great-great-grandfather worked, all of it seems locked in. All of it seems beyond anyone's control. So here's the question. Once you understand how success actually works, once you see the hidden machinery, can you do anything about it? Or are we all just passengers on trains that left the station 100 years before we were born? Gladwell's answer is no, you are not a passenger. And the proof of it is a 12-year-old girl named Marita. Chapter 8. Marita's Bargain. Marita lives in the South Bronx, one of the poorest and most troubled neighborhoods in New York City. She is 12 years old. Her mother is a single parent. The public school she used to go to was, by every measure, a disaster. Failing test scores, overwhelmed teachers, students years behind grade level. By every sociological metric, Marita should be on a trajectory that looks nothing like success. Her zip code, her income bracket, her single-parent household, the kind of school she was supposed to attend. On paper, she has almost every disadvantage the American system produces. But Marita's mother did something that changed everything. She applied her daughter to a middle school called KIPP Academy, and Marita got in. KIPP is part of a network of public charter schools that takes kids like Marita, inner-city kids from struggling families, and produces results that should not be possible. KIPP middle schoolers at graduation routinely score above the middle-class average in math and English. Their students go on to college at a rate 4 times higher than the national average for low-income kids. Something is happening at KIPP, and Gladwell wanted to know what, so he shadowed Marita for a day. Let me walk you through what her life actually looks like. Marita wakes up at 5:45 in the morning. Her mother has to be at work early, so Marita makes her own breakfast and gets herself ready. She leaves her apartment before 7. She takes the city bus to KIPP Academy. She arrives at school at 7:25. The school day begins at 7:30 and does not end until 5 in the afternoon. That's a 9.5-hour school day for a 12-year-old. After school, Marita does not go home. She goes to KIPP's extended program. She has clubs, she has tutoring, she has homework help. She finally leaves the school building around 5:30. Then she gets on the bus. She rides home. She gets to her apartment around 6:30 in the evening. She eats dinner, and then she starts her homework. KIPP assigns enormous amounts of homework, hours of it. Marita will typically work on homework from 7 until about 11 at night. Sometimes later. She goes to sleep around 11 or 11:30. She gets up again at 5:45. That is Marita's life. 5 days a week, plus Saturday classes at KIP every other week, plus a required 3-week summer session every year. There is no Sunday morning cartoons. There is no hanging out at the park. There is no long phone call with a friend. There is school, there is homework, and there is sleep. Marita, at 12, works harder than most adults I know. Now when you hear that, you might have one of two reactions. You might be horrified. What kind of childhood is that? Or you might be impressed. Both reactions miss something important. Here's what KIP is actually doing. It is giving Marita something her neighborhood, her income bracket, and her family history cannot give her. It is giving her more hours. There's a remarkable piece of research that explains why this matters. A sociologist named Carl Alexander at Johns Hopkins University studied Baltimore elementary school students over many years, and he made a discovery that should have made headlines for a decade. Alexander looked at reading scores and math scores during the school year, and he looked at them again in the fall after summer break. What he found was this. During the school year, kids from low-income families learn at almost the same rate as kids from wealthy families. The gap does not grow during the school year. The poor kids and the rich kids gain ability at more or less the same speed. But during the summer, something very different happens. The wealthy kids keep learning. They go to camps. They travel. Their parents read to them. They get enrichment. They continue to grow. The low-income kids, meanwhile, do not learn much during the summer. They are home. They are watching TV. Their parents are working multiple jobs. There is no enrichment happening. So every summer, the wealthy kids pull ahead a little bit. And every school year, everybody learns at the same pace. And the gap, summer by summer, compounds. By the time these kids are in 5th grade, the achievement gap between rich and poor students is enormous. And Alexander's research showed that virtually all of that gap comes not from what happens in school, but from what happens during the months when school is out. The problem isn't that poor kids are worse learners. The problem is that they have fewer hours. So what does KIP do? KIP takes those lost hours back. An average American school year is about 1,080 hours. A KIP school year is close to 1,500 hours. Over 4 years of middle school, a KIP student spends roughly 60% more time in school than a typical American student. And that is why a kid like Marita, by the time she graduates from KIP, has the same academic foundation as a middle-class kid from a wealthy suburb. Not because she's smarter, not because she was born different, because she was given the hours. Remember the 10,000-hour rule? Remember Bill Gates getting access to a computer in 1968 when almost no other teenager in the world could? Remember the Beatles playing 8-hour sets in Hamburg? What KIP is doing for Marita is, on a smaller scale, the same thing. It is giving her the opportunity to put in the hours that her neighborhood was not otherwise going to give her. And that is the quiet, radical promise of this chapter. Once you understand how success actually works, once you see that it is built on opportunity and hours and cultural inheritance, you can intervene. You can build institutions that give kids the hours they were denied. You can change the cutoff dates for hockey leagues so January kids don't run away with the advantage. You can teach practical intelligence to kids whose parents couldn't. You can do all of this deliberately if you choose to. The question is whether we will choose to. Marita is doing her part. She's making a bargain. She's giving up a normal childhood. And in exchange, she is getting what her mother and her grandmother and her great-grandmother could never have given her, a real shot at a future. And when you see that bargain clearly, you start to understand something about every outlier. Every single one of them made a bargain. The Beatles gave up 4 years of normal youth to stand on a Hamburg stage. Bill Gates gave up sleep for 6 years to program in a university lab. Joe Flom sewed shoulder pads in his head every day while other kids were playing. Every outlier paid, and every outlier needed somebody to create the space where the payment was possible. The miracle of KIP is not that Marita is working hard. Kids all over America are working hard. The miracle is that somebody built the building, designed the curriculum, hired the teachers, and kept the lights on until 10 at night, so that her hard work could turn into something. Every outlier has a Hamburg. Every outlier has a lakeside school. Marita's is a charter school in the South Bronx.
Because in the end, that is what this whole book has been about. It has been about the places where ordinary people get the extraordinary opportunity to become great, and about the obligation the rest of us have to build more of those places.
So let me bring all of this together. The takeaways of Outliers. The ideas that should stay with you long after you close this book. The first idea is this: success is not an individual achievement. It is a collaboration between a person and the world around them. Talent matters, but talent alone is a seed that needs soil. The hockey player needs the right birthday. The programmer needs the right decade. The lawyer needs the right prejudice to push him into the right specialty. The outlier is not a self-made person. The outlier is the product of a collision between a person and an opportunity. When you understand this, something beautiful happens. You stop being jealous of the people who made it, and you stop being ashamed of the times you didn't, because you realize that a huge amount of what we call fortune is just timing, geography, and circumstance. Things nobody controls and nobody deserves. The second idea is this: the 10,000 hours is real. It is not a magic number, and it is not a guarantee, but mastery, in almost any serious domain, requires an enormous, almost unimaginable quantity of focused practice. Nobody skips it. Nobody is so talented they can float past it. The Beatles put in the hours. Bill Gates put in the hours. Mozart put in the hours. If you want to be excellent at something, you have to make peace with the fact that excellence is mostly repetition. And the honest question for any of us is, do I have access to the 10,000 hours? Do I have the time, the resources, the environment? Because if I don't, I need to either find a way to create it or choose a different mountain. The third idea is this: practical intelligence matters as much as raw intelligence, maybe more. The ability to speak to authority, to navigate institutions, to make your case, to not take no for an answer. These are skills. They are taught in homes, usually without a word ever being said about them. And if you did not get them in childhood, you can get them in adulthood, but you have to know to go looking. Chris Langan did not lose because he wasn't smart enough. He lost because nobody had taught him how to win. The fourth idea is this: you are carrying ancestors inside you. The way you respond to an insult, the way you talk to your boss, the way you approach a hard math problem, the way you feel about effort. These are not purely individual traits. They are partly inherited in ways that have nothing to do with biology. They are cultural legacies, stored in your reflexes and your assumptions, handed to you by generations you never met. The good news is that once you see them, you can choose which ones to keep and which ones to set down. You don't have to be a prisoner of an inheritance you can now name. The fifth idea is the most important. We can, if we choose, build the world so that more people get a chance to become outliers. We can change the hockey cutoff dates. We can build more schools like KIPP. We can stop pretending that our current system is a meritocracy and start asking honestly, who are we sorting out, and are we sure we should be? Gladwell's argument is not a complaint. It is an invitation. Once you understand that every outlier was made possible by a series of opportunities, the question becomes, who is capable of becoming an outlier if we gave them the opportunities? And the answer, according to everything in this book, is far more people than we currently let through. And if that's true, then we are not just living in a society that wastes talent. We are living in a society that is choosing quietly every day to waste it. And that choice is reversible. I want to end this book the way Gladwell ends it, with a personal story. Because at the end of all the data and all the research and all the case studies, Gladwell turned the lens around. He wrote an epilogue about his own family, about how a Jamaican boy in the 19th century, and a skin color hierarchy nobody talks about anymore, and a tiny scholarship that got awarded to the right girl in the right year, eventually turned into the career of the most famous non-fiction writer in America. His mother was a brown-skinned woman from a small village in Jamaica. She won a scholarship to England in the 1950s. That scholarship existed because, over generations, her family had accumulated just enough social standing in Jamaica's layered post-slavery society for her to be considered eligible. That social standing itself traced back to a specific white ancestor in the 18th century who had purchased and then freed her enslaved great-great-great-grandmother. The freed woman's children were lighter skinned than other black Jamaicans, which, under the brutal logic of that colonial society, gave them access to schools and jobs that darker-skinned Jamaicans could not reach. None of that was fair. None of it was earned. Gladwell's mother didn't choose her skin color any more than a Canadian hockey player chose his birthday. The advantage was there because of centuries of violence and accident and choices made by other people, and Gladwell, with the full weight of his own career behind him, turns at the end of his book and says, "This is me too. I am also an outlier in the sense this whole book has been describing. I did not get here by myself. I am standing on top of my mother, who is standing on top of her mother, who is standing on top of a scholarship, who is standing on top of a skin color, who is standing on top of a slave ship in the 18th century, and to pretend otherwise is to be blind to my own life." There is something deeply moving about an author ending his book that way, because it's an admission, it's a reckoning, it's the final piece of the puzzle. Even Malcolm Gladwell, sitting in his perch at the New Yorker, writing the book that will become a global bestseller, even he is not self-made. He knows it. He wants you to know it too. And if that's true of him, it's true of all of us. Every one of us who has ever gotten a break. Every one of us who has ever made it, in ways big or small. We stand on shoulders we often cannot even see. And so the book closes, finally, on a choice. You can take this information and use it to feel bitter about the ways the world was stacked for or against you. Or you can take it and use it to feel grateful for the hands that reached down and helped pull you up, and to do the work of reaching down yourself for someone else every chance you get. Because in the end, the story of success is also the story of who we choose to become to other people. Every outlier needed someone. Every outlier was carried, even if they'll never admit it. And the most meaningful thing we can do with our one strange, improbable life is to become the person who carries someone else. That is the final lesson of Outliers. It is not what we usually take from it, but I think it is what Gladwell most wants us to understand. We are all outliers in the sense that we all got here through 1,000 small gifts we did not deserve. The only question left is, what will we do with the gifts before they are taken back? I want to leave you with a question, not a big one, a small one. It's the one I couldn't stop thinking about after I finished this book. Somewhere in your life, there is a Hamburg, a place or a time that gave you the hours you needed to become who you are. A teacher who stayed late, a family member who believed in you early, a weird job that taught you more than it paid you, a summer that rearranged your brain. Most of us never properly thank the people who gave us our Hamburg. We're too busy telling the self-made version of our story. But it is never too late to go back, to write the letter, to make the call, to say, I know what you did for me. I know I would not be here without you. That's the practice this book left me with. Not a habit, not a system, just a question. Who was your Hamburg, and have you told them? If you'd like to go deeper with this book, the full audiobook from Malcolm Gladwell himself is available on Audible. His narration is extraordinary. He brings a warmth and a rhythm to his own writing that you don't always get from audiobook readers. You'll find a link in the description below for both the Audible version and the print edition on Amazon. And if this conversation meant something to you, you can support the channel by subscribing. Every book we cover tries to give you this, A real, patient walk through a big idea, the way a friend would explain it to you over coffee. New summaries go up every week. Thanks for spending this time with me. Take care of yourself. And remember, somewhere out there, right now, there is a kid who is one opportunity away from being the next outlier. Maybe the opportunity is yours to give. See you in the next one.